Chapter 26 Vondales and the Elk.
Maybe you should have wished us a way out of here,
Cody said as they rushed back down the hall to the doorway to the ravine. It was standing open and the sound of clashing steel echoed off the walls.
How did you get it open?
Hale asked. We didn't, Val said. We looked up and it was opening on its own. When we looked back, Caitlin was healed and headed your way.
I don't remember much, just the light, and the pain was gone and my fingers tingled. But I knew I had to get to you. I knew you were in danger,
Caitlin said. We're all still in danger. Stay behind us, Val said. Vondale's men, better trained than Redmont's, were making it a fierce battle, despite their disadvantage of numbers. Numerous bodies from both sides littered the ground. Redmont's men blocked the main pathway out, making a stand in the narrowest part of the ravine. Val and Cody armed themselves with the swords of dead men. Red was nowhere to be seen, but her father was behind his men, shooting around them with a crossbow. Let's take one of these shafts, Val said, turning to one of the smaller openings.
We don't know where they go,
Caitlin said.
We stand a better chance against the dark than against that lot,
Cody said. They made their way, feeling along the walls in the darkness, dusty stone and splintering braces passing at intervals. Hale was relieved when he heard the sound of rushing water and could see the flicker of torchlight ahead of them. The shaft opened up into the cavern filled with the rock-crushing machinery, the belts still running although no one was left to tend to them. Come on, Val said, striking out across the floor. They rushed beneath catwalks and around wheelbarrows full of rubble to a bridge that crossed the river that powered the gears of the conveyor belt. They were almost across when Vondale stepped out of the shadows. Blades descended from his forearms, the muscles of his shoulders bulging and pumping with his racing pulse. His eyes fell on Caitlin, and his face flashed confusion for a moment before he sprang at Cody. Vondales was calm, a seasoned fighter, and efficient as a predator. Cody, caught off guard, scrambled to deflect his blows. With his blades fastened to his mangled hands, Vondales was one with his weapons. They were extensions of his body, and he fought without extraneous movement or panicked reactions. Cody stumbled, fell, and dropped his shield after a shocking blow from Vondales. Vondale swept his blades past Cody and was stopped short of slicing his neck only by Val, who came crashing in with an overhead blow to Vondale's shoulder. His layers of plate and mail held, though, and Vondale shrugged off the strike, then swung at Val, forcing him to weave away. Vondale stomped on Cody's fallen shield, caught it as it flipped upwards, and flung it at Val, who ducked. It was just what Vondales wanted, for while the captain was bent over, Vondales leapt in the air, bringing both blades down on Val's neck. They stopped before reaching their target. This time they were stuck in the antlers of the elk. It had galloped in so quickly Hale had not even taken notice until the elk swept into the center of the battle and sparks were flying off its crown. Val hurried to help Cody to his feet while the elk and Vondales became lost in their own confrontation. By the way Vondales hissed, spat, and growled as he fought, the enmity between the two was clear. The elk was not defenseless. He dipped, swung, and jabbed with his antlers like a battery of spears and swords, deflecting Vondale's strikes and making his own. The caverns echoed with the clash of steel on antler, hooves on stone, and the shattering of rocks in the still-turning grinder. Vondales let out a cry of exultation when he scored a strike on the elk's head, leaving a red gash on its face. Vondales held up his ruined hands.
A few more of those and we'll be even, Adamantus.
The elk sought new ground, clambering up a set of stairs, sure-footed as a billy goat, and ran out onto a catwalk that spanned the rumbling conveyor belt. Vondales followed. At the same time, Silas and two men entered, their own armor dented, scratched, and splattered with blood. They had either fled Redmont and his men, or defeated them. Whatever the case, Vondales rallied them, calling out,
The elk! Kill the elk!
Not if we have anything to do with it, Val said, and with Cody rushed the trio. Silas stepped out to engage them both, meeting them on the bridge over the water. The other two climbed the ladder to the opposite end of the catwalk and closed in on the elk. He miscalculated, Hale said, crouched behind a boulder.
Who?
Caitlin asked. The elk. He's trapped. Vondales crept in, waiting for his two other men to stalk the elk from behind. The elk kept its head turned sideways, watching the approach from behind and before it, all the while backing up and away from Vondales, whom it must have perceived as the greater threat. We have to help, Caitlin said. Follow me. Hale sprinted around a barrel of rusted shovels and pickaxes and leapt over a wheelbarrow before reaching the creaking conveyor belt with its whirring gears and spinning wheels. He grabbed a rock as it moved past and flung it at Vondales. It bounced off his armor harmlessly, but came close enough to his face to give him pause. Caitlin followed suit, reaming the other men with rocks. Not as heavily armored as Vondales, they each raised their shields sideways to deflect any additional stones as they rushed the elk. It was just the opening the elk needed. As they approached, it tipped forward towards Vondales and kicked out with its hindquarters like an angry donkey. It caught the first man in the chest, sending him tumbling into the second, who lost his footing entirely, flipped over the handrail, and plummeted through the air into the rushing water where he disappeared in the white spray. Vondales rushed forward and stabbed again at the elk's face, only to be frustrated by the rack of antlers. He drove his blades further this time, locking them up and twisting the elk's neck. The second man lifted his sword to stab downward, but the elk stopped him short with its leg. The animal did not escape unscathed, for the blade grazed its leg and a gash opened there. But its attacker overcompensated while righting himself and had to grab onto the shaking handrail. Cody had just reached them and kicked Vondale's man before he could steady himself and sent him tumbling over the handrail. His body flipped once in the air before he struck his head on the conveyor belt and landed, unmoving, on the floor. Vondales flexed his arms and twisted the elk's neck. The elk shuffled its hooves and tried to realign its body, but Vondales had leverage on his side. They were locked in a stalemate, pushing against one another. Cody, in an effort to upset the balance, swung his sword into the nearest handrail, snapping it. The catwalk shook and pitched dangerously to the side, but still Vondales remained locked with the elk, sweat beading on his forehead, fresh blood dripping from his blades, the tendons in his neck taut, his remaining fingers curled into incomplete fists. But the elk was not out of tricks. It pushed forward and blew a stream of air out between its lips before it rose up on its hind legs. Antlers, blades, and Vondales lifted into the air while all their weight teetered on the elk's two rear legs, like a circus performance. Then the elk wildly wheeled its front legs and struck Vondales once in the mouth and again in his chest. One of his forearms let out a muffled crack and bent at a grotesque angle until a jagged white bone stabbed through the skin. Vondales cried out as one blade, then the other slipped free of the antlers with a noise like a sword being sharpened. He fell through the air before crashing onto the conveyor belt, his body lying uneven on all the rocks below him. He moved with a groan and a rattle of armor, pulling himself onto his elbows where he realized he was moving towards the heavy rollers cracking rocks into dust. He swept past Hale, reaching out, rocks falling beneath him, frustrating his every attempt to get off. He fell on his broken wrist and cried out. In a desperate last bid, he reached over the edge of the moving belt for anything, anyone. Caitlin was there. She had run down the length of the belt and met him towards the end where she took his good hand in both of hers. Before Hale could ask her what she was doing, she turned to him. "Help me!" Somehow, to his own surprise, Hale found himself wrapping Caitlin's hands and Vondale's in his own while he anchored his feet against the side of the belt. He pulled with all his weight. For a moment he was looking into Vondale's face. How transformed it was. Red, desperate, scared. Gone was the man who had hurt so many others, and in his place was a frightened, pleading boy. Perhaps that was what Caitlin had seen right away, and so she had not hesitated to act. But both her feet and Hale's were slipping. The gears of the belt were turning with loud squeaks, and the rocks under Vondale's were rolling. His broken hand was useless, but he tried to use his elbow to reposition his grip with Caitlin and Hale. But with such few fingers, his hand failed him. He turned over briefly when he knew he was moving inexorably towards the tiny gap between the rollers. Caitlin looked away, her face in Hale's chest, as Vondales kicked out at the machine only for the spinning rollers to draw his boot in between them with a loud crunch. Leather split at the seams of his boots, followed by the sound of metal popping as his greaves were drawn in as well. The wheels jammed briefly, but mechanical force won out in the end, and the rollers continued spinning, great bloody swaths left on their impervious faces. The elk limped its way down the catwalk. Cody swung down on a loose cable. Silas, realizing he was now outnumbered, turned his back on Val and ran into a shaft, his footsteps echoing after him. At the same time, more of Redmont's men appeared from the direction of the mine's entrance. Val rallied their numbers in the center of the room. "We'll make a break for the other side, where we came in," he said. But their plan was thwarted when Silas reappeared with his remaining companions. Arrows started to fly across the chamber between the two sides.
Do you have a different plan, sir?
Cody asked Val as they all hid behind the conveyor belt. Val ducked an arrow that flew overhead in the crossfire, and another bounced across the floor, landing near their feet.
Nothing brilliant comes to mind just at the moment. We could wait and let one side finish the other,
Cody suggested. Leaving us to fight the winners. I don't like our odds.
How about we swim?
Caitlin yelled over the din of the machine.
What?
Val and Cody asked in unison. Caitlin pointed at the white frothing water coursing through the center of the cavern.
It has to come out somewhere.
The elk huffed and snorted.
Did he just nod?
Cody asked. It's foolhardy, Val said.
It might be our only way, Caitlin said. After all, I'm hoping the goddess didn't heal me just to let me down.
With that she ran, head down, across the cavern floor to the river and jumped, disappearing into the sluicing wash. With a clatter of hoofbeats, the elk followed. I'll be damned, Val said.
Is this our plan?
Cody asked. It's mine, Hale said before he stood up, sprinted under a catwalk, and jumped over the edge to follow.